very much. Thanks everyone who's attending this session. I'd like to thank the 5 co-conveners of this session. As Xavier explained, I will build very much on the outcomes of an ongoing report, a joint initiative by the OECD and the World Bank. And the report is very much covering the impacts of COVID-19 on the water and sanitation sector, but also on irrigation for agriculture, especially affecting water tariffs, but not only. It covers measures adopted by countries and impacts on financial planning. It also focuses on concrete impacts of some specific operators, and I will mention some of them afterwards. And there's also a comprehensive overview of water and recovery and resilience packages with emphasis on 21 countries in all different continents. So all continents are represented in this overview. As per the impacts that we've assessed, we've seen like very clear trends in some cases, although data on this and data sets are still like a moving target because the pandemic is not over. But we've seen a slowdown of investments, not pervasive, but CapEx and OpEx plans have been affected in most cases. We've actually seen a CapEx decline at 7% in terms of pre-investment worldwide. The spending on water operations worldwide fell by 1% in 2020 with an expected rise of 1.9% in 2021. We've seen, of course, you've all seen as citizens, a supply disruption in some cases. The most relevant impacts in this case actually refer to the efforts to avoid supply cuts. So what we've seen is, for instance, that some temporary decisions might become permanent in some cases, especially in middle and low income countries. We've also seen that revenues of water utilities have been affected almost with no exception, although with no unique pattern. It's been a reduction of 15% on average has been reported, but according to the World Bank drawing on IB net data sets, collection rates as a result of COVID-19 have reduced worldwide by 40%. We've also seen a very simple, it's quite easy to explain this, but we've also seen a decrease in industrial water demand by 27% on average. And one of the things that I would like to highlight at this point is that the effects of a crisis emergency measures on revenues and long-term objectives is being quite clear. For instance, there's been some emergency measures in Peru in order to allow for utilities to cover for some cash flow problems that we fear that may become permanent if no encompassing measures are adopted in the near future. And we've also seen effects in financially robustness or solvency. So how short-term revenue shortfalls and less favorable borrowing conditions, generally coping with liquidity gaps, also seem to be translating into long-term concerns about the solvency of water operators or overall end water users. Something that I would like to highlight is that this is even the case in consolidated markets. So for instance, if you look at a very consolidated market with a strong economic regulator like England and Wales, what you see is that there's also been quite a significant impact. So the impact on the UK 9 largest water utilities shows an accumulated variation in operating profits in December 2020 that goes from almost 100% in wash water to minus 7.1% in Anglian water. And what we've seen overall, not just in the UK, but in other high-income countries, is that COVID-19 has put an additional strain in countries in which there was already an overhaul of tariffs, especially for residents, on a sector that was already under pressure from political and regulatory bodies. To do what? To reform the water and wastewater industry. So there was a demand for infrastructural improvements, a demand for environmental measures, and now there is an additional demand to deliver at low cost. So this is putting additional strain on these water users. Some of these specific impacts for high-income countries' utilities are things like credit rating downgrades and an increasing number of appeals to the regulating bodies in terms of price settlement. We've also seen that there is a reduced scope of revenue collection and that this is making it harder for utilities to meet performance targets. And as I said before, we also see that there might be a trend towards long-term financial trouble for utilities. So if I focus in terms of some of the recommendations and I focus on the structure of the 3 questions suggested by the co-conveners of this session, I'd like to make a few points for you to discuss. So this is food for thought so that we can discuss as part of the session. In terms of the potential role for financiers and investors, what we see is first that green and inclusive recovery requires both public and private capital. So we see that there are large investments that are often beyond the means of the public sector alone. We see, secondly, that private green and social finance is becoming financially driven. So in the past, it was investors' environmental and social goals that initially drove global growth in sustainable investment in the water sector. But now we see that financial motives are increasingly coming to the fore. The third point that I would like to share is that sustainable finance yields real environmental and social benefits. So there's actually a financial and economic case to invest in water, and there's actually a financial and economic case in including water in a determined way as part of recovery and resilience packages. And the last point around this first question is that there's a clear need for engaged and predictable public policy as central to nurturing social and green finance in the water sector. The second question proposed by the co-conveners, which I found really interesting, is how can we make sure that we don't make the same mistakes we've done so far? So what we've seen is first, when going through the recovery and resilience packages that we have reviewed as part of this assessment, what we see is that most of them are very timid in how they factor in water issues. Some others follow a too conventional fashion. So for instance, bridging infrastructural gaps rather than innovating and transforming in the water sector. We've also seen quite an interesting contrast, and I'm very glad that we've got today high representatives, both of the European Commission and the Environmental Protection Agency of the US, because we've seen an interesting contrast between the Biden's Green New Deal and the Disaster Relief Fund and the American Jobs Plan, that very significant financial stimulus plans, and the EU Green Deal and Next Generation EU and the Recovery and Resilience Facility within Next Generation EU, which I think is something that we can discuss later on. Then, some of the growth drivers in the water and sanitation sector as a result of these resilience and recovery plans to date are increasing compliance requirements with water and environmental legislation, sustainability goals driven by increasing investor involvement, and also the use of treated sewage water for industrial raw water. So water reclamation and reuse, especially for the industrial sector, but we also see a potential for agriculture and for environmental restoration. But what we see with concern is that main challenges are not necessarily addressed. So we don't see liquidity challenges and mandates to conserve cash. And at the same time, we definitely not see at all liquidity concerns, how liquidity concerns translated into long-term solvency problems are being tackled by these recovery and resilience packages. So some recommendations around these resilience and and recovery packages would be to reinforce targeted investments, so to increase the low level of funding, to pay attention to the level of investment, also in the level of service, not just in infrastructural development, and with a lot of emphasis worldwide in rural areas. Also to consider that policy coordination is a must, an unresolved matter, that there are synergies between water-related investments that are still untapped. And also something that is really important, it's not just about designing recovery and resilience efforts, it's also about getting the implementation right on financial grounds as well. And last but not least, in terms of environmental justice, I would say that some of the conclusions stemming from this analysis would be that the concept of environmental justice should be a guiding principle for water policy development. I see a lack of public debate on the social burden of water policy and environmental policy overall. I think it's important that environmental inequalities, and especially when they refer to water and access to water services, should be considered in the design and implementation of policy through the impact assessment process. We need good spatial data that can be assessed at reasonable cost and guidance on methods to assess inequalities around water access. And also the financial impacts of water policy. We know that sometimes they may have the potential to be regressive, but I see a lot of emphasis, too much talking about the level of the tariffs and not so much about the structure and design of the tariffs, when in fact the problem is not so much in the level of the tariff, but in terms of the levels of absolute and relative poverty and exposure to social exclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Gonzalo. Thank you also for keeping to time. Very interesting scene setting based on, again, a thorough review of the documentation in a range of countries. And thanks also for planting the seeds for further discussion with the rest of the panel. The second speaker in that session is Michael Dean. Michael works for the US EPA Office of Water, and in particular in the branch in charge of the very well-known and renowned Clean Water State Revolving Fund. Michael, in your capacity, you can accelerate finance that contributes to clean water and to a greener environment. In the US, where do you see opportunities for water-related investments to contribute to a greener, fairer, and more inclusive recovery?
Just make sure I didn't mute. Sorry. Thank you, Xavier, and thank you to OECD and the World Bank and the other conveners of the session today at World Water Week. And thank you, Gonzalo, for that excellent summary of the recent OECD World Bank analysis. And I'll offer brief reflection on it from the perspective of the US. Investing in water, certainly can contribute to green, resilient, and inclusive recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. We have that opportunity, as Xavier just mentioned, but in my mind, it is far from a foregone conclusion that we'll successfully do so. First, we must be very intentional in making wise and sustainable investments in the midst of broad recovery plans and programs that actually have multiple objectives wrapped in the name of recovery. First and foremost, of course, as the pandemic continues, is public health. And then there's economic development and job growth. And of course, mitigation of and resiliency to climate change. And as Gonzalo touched on at the end, environmental justice and the rebuilding of historically underserved communities that have not benefited from the investments we previously made in the services and the quality of life that they deliver. So I will submit, and I think everyone engaged with World Water Week would agree, that water is central to achieving all of those objectives. But we must recognize and accept that the legislators and the policymakers developing these recovery programs likely do not have water at the top of their mind or their intentions as they develop these programs. So that is our job, and I think Xavier started off with that as well. How do we communicate with the people who can have that impact and connect them to the true needs for water? In the US, our Congress has already enacted recovery programs providing substantial new funding for water and continues to consider additional legislation that may provide significantly more money. First, in March of this year, the American Rescue Plan Act was passed, which provides $350 billion to state and local government entities. And one of the four eligible uses of those funds is investment in water and wastewater infrastructure. So we're starting to see those funds flow through the US Treasury directly to states and localities for those investments. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, recently passed by the Senate, but not yet in the House, appropriates an additional $55 billion for water infrastructure, or would appropriate that money, including through the State Revolving Fund program and others with kind of conventional. A lot of that is based on lead. I'm sure you've read to deal with the lead issues and emerging contaminants issues, but we also have the opportunity to try to direct those towards some of the more resilient solutions as well. So this all sounds great, this money coming and what we can do with it, but we face a critical challenge, and that is how to ensure, or at least maximize the likelihood that these water investments are innovative and transformative and lead to the green and resilient and inclusive future that we're talking about today in this session, and don't simply flow to the conventional projects that reinforce the unsustainable status quo that we face and has led to a lot of success, but also a lot of ongoing problems. And as we work to drive such transformational change on the ground, we need to acknowledge the constraints within which we work, which will be different throughout the world, in a very diverse world and governance structures. For example, in the US, we are a very federalized system. The national government develops plans and priorities and appropriate funds for recovery. And then we work with our state partners, who may have somewhat different priorities as they work to recover their communities from the pandemic. The good news is I believe we have learned some lessons from our last major recovery effort, and that was the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act in 2009 in response to the Great Recession. The first lesson I would like to make sure we learn is while recovery is urgent, we need to take the time to do it right. That program in 2009 mandated that funds be put to work within 12 months when they're made available by Congress, which sounds reasonable, particularly if your focus is on jobs and economic development. But I think it led to some spending on some projects of perhaps questionable priority and benefits. Someone recently said to me, let's focus not on projects that are shovel ready, but those that are shovel worthy. The second lesson from that program is very positive, and that is that, for example, the program I run at EPA, the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, established a green project reserve that directed a significant portion of the funding to green infrastructure, including energy and water conservation within the utilities, and also nature-based solutions for broader water quality efforts. This was an opportunity to focus on non-conventional, often more resilient solutions to the water quality challenges our nation faces, and showed investing in water can deliver tremendous benefits to communities across the country. If you have that intention and the programmatic and policy changes to direct funds to these types of projects. It has been far from perfect, but it does indicate the direction that we must take. It's far too easy, as I mentioned before, to fall back on what we know and are comfortable with, which is just push money as quickly as possible into the pipeline of projects that we've had there to replace aging existing infrastructure without stopping to think about whether that infrastructure is the best way and the most resilient way, the greenest and most inclusive way of delivering these services. Many communities that have suffered most of the pandemic, both in terms of public health and the devastating economic deterioration that many neighborhoods faced, were already the communities that were underserved by safe drinking water and sanitation, and disproportionately affected by climate impacts such as flooding and sewage backups in their neighborhoods. As we strive to build back better, we as water leaders must show how these big picture recovery objectives that I mentioned at the beginning, public health, economic development and jobs, climate resiliency and environmental justice, how they can meet these communities where they live and improve the lives of these communities through water investments delivering sustainable environmental and social benefits. Again, it sounds good. It's a lot of hard work. We're in the midst of it here in the United States, as you know, other countries are as well, of trying to work to make sure that these funds are delivered equitably, inclusively, as quickly as possible, but also as productively as possible, looking for the future, not just short-term recovery. So with that, I will look forward to my colleagues speaking and our discussion, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael, for a very frank and candid presentation of the situation in the US, and also for highlighting quite a few very valid and I think inspiring messages. I take the one on the multiple objective of the recovery packages that may not necessarily align with the focus of the discussion today. Your point about the pace of project planning and disbursement, it takes time to design the appropriate project that can be transformative, and also, yeah, how much can these recovery packages be transformational? So I think that's there is a lot of food for thought for the next stage of our session. The next speaker is Bettina Döser. Bettina is the head of unit for water in DG Environment at the European Commission. Bettina, we all appreciate that the European Commission has put up an impressive package for recovery and resilience. As the head of the water unit, where do you see water and water policy contribute to a greener and fairer recovery?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present a bit the perspective from the EU side. So a lot of what I was going to say has actually already been mentioned, so I apologize if I'm repetitive, but I think the messages are very salient and important. So first of all, it has already been mentioned that the EU has embarked on a so-called Green Deal. And this Green Deal was announced at the beginning of this mandate of the current Commission. And the Green Deal really is the EU's growth strategy. So this was set out, and a schedule of individual initiatives which would decline this in more detail was set out. And this was before COVID hit, in fact, 1 year before COVID hit. And the European Green Deal was really supposed, and still is, of course, to set out how Europe can transform to carbon neutrality, to a path towards zero pollution and everything that comes with it, a circular economy and so on. Water has a very prominent place in all of this, in the original Green Deal announcement, but also in all the initiatives that have come out since then. Some of them are also very well known by now. You may have heard of not only the Circular Economy Action Plan, but also the Biodiversity Strategy, which focuses notably on river continuity, the Adaptation Strategy, which has a whole new set of actions to address water management in view of climate change impacts, and many more. And this also coincides with a really crucial period of implementation of our EU water legislation, was already mentioned by Gonzalo and also by Xavier before. Implementation of our legislation is really the key to drive forward water and also water investments. Now, investments in water, we've been working on what we need to move forward to get to where we want to be with the situation of water in the EU. And then the crisis hit and a whole new situation came about. So the first is actually maybe less obvious, but we realized in the EU that water can actually help us manage the crisis and manage the virus. You may know that we have set up a program with our member states to actually increasingly monitor the virus in our wastewater. We have invested in this. I think this is also a very good example of how investments in the recovery can be good for water and for the recovery in itself. But of course, the recovery period now coincides also with this period where we are trying to implement a lot of measures that the member states have set out several years ago in their so-called river basin management plans and programs of measures, where, by the way, they also have to say what these measures cost. So when COVID came and when the recovery package was announced, our member states pretty much already had in mind what kind of measures they would have to take anyway. And the trick now is to see how during the recovery period we can use these opportunities that Xavier has already mentioned also, and how we can make the best possible use of this massive funding opportunities to really make the most of it for the economy, for the relaunch of the economy, and of course for water. So we are talking about water quality management, also water quantity management. We're talking about digitalization of water, which, by the way, is a very important priority of the recovery and resilience plans, as they are called in the EU, and some of which have also been analyzed in this new document that Gonzalo was presenting. I wanted to make the point that our water investment agenda, and here, by the way, we're also working together with the OECD very closely to help our member states devise their various investment strategies. Our water investments will not only come from the recovery and resilience plan, but from a whole plethora of tools made available, not only at EU level, but also to be coupled with private investment and national investment. Gonzalo, you mentioned this as well, that of course, it cannot only be public money that funds all these investment needs. So our recovery and resilience plans in the EU cannot be seen in isolation. They are one of several tools that are being made available. Another very important tool is, of course, the next financial framework, as we call it in the EU. This is the money that will become available for our member states under various programs, for agriculture under the Common Agricultural Policy, for cohesion, and there again, there will be water investments on a massive scale. We even have a so-called enabling conditions to make sure that a lot of investments will be made in water infrastructure. We also have another tool that I wanted to highlight here because Gonzalo, you mentioned that increasingly there seems to be a trend that water investments also have to make sense financially. So in the EU, we have a new tool, the so-called taxonomy regulation, and this sets out when investments, both by public and private investments, can be considered sustainable in EU terms. And in this regulation, water is one of the key objectives. It's one of 6 objectives. And so at the moment, implementing legislation is becoming available to help investments and to tell everybody which investments in water are good, are sustainable. And we hope that this will indeed drive towards a situation where investments are sustainable, but are also economically and financially worth it. And here is then where we come to the real win-win situation. You've asked at the beginning, Xavier, what types of projects we would see as being specifically useful. So a lot has been said already about infrastructure, sanitation, wastewater treatment, and so on. With the European Green Deal, we want to expand this, made this wider, and this is reflected in the many initiatives like the biodiversity initiative or the adaptation initiative, or also the circular economy that I mentioned already. We want to go more into broader investments, into nature-based solutions, into investments that are not only on gray infrastructure, but really that fulfill many purposes. One example is, for example, our new drive, and this is of course also linked to the Water Framework Directive, to get better river continuity, to take down those dams that are no longer necessary, and to make sure that nature is given the chance to do its job, because this is an investment that may not be so expensive at the outset, but that will reap huge benefits. We have some calculations on what specifically it costs to take down a dam as compared to what benefits this will present to the whole ecosystem. So this is where we want to go. One last word, because I know I'm past my time.
Very, very short.
Yes, we have in the European Green Deal a so-called do no significant harm principle, and all investments that are paid for by EU funds, but also under the taxonomy regulation, are inspected on whether they do harm to the environment and whether they do harm specifically to water. So when we looked at our member states' recovery and resilience plans, of course, we also looked at that, and we even included some so-called milestones in some of these plans to make sure that some of these investments that may give a real boost to the economy do no harm to our water, and by this, again, bring water back into the focus and help water also get to its full potential in the economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bettina. I was hesitant to call you to ask you to come to an end, but these are all very relevant and topical points. So thanks for sharing. I will jump to our last speaker, who is Mauricio Lopez. Mauricio is the technical vice president of ADESCO, which is the National Association of Public Utilities in Colombia. And my question to you, Mauricio, is I wonder if you could share with us some measures in place in Colombia whereby water contributes to an inclusive recovery.
And good morning or good afternoon for all, depending of the country that receive that signal. In order to tell you about ANDESCO, we are the Colombia's National Association of Utilities and Communications. ANDESCO groups together the companies that provide water and sanitation, electric energy, natural gas, ICT, and TV, with a representation close to 90% of the population served at the national level. Currently, we have 160 associated companies from all sectors: public companies, public-private companies, and private companies. And our fundamental mission is to represent the interests of companies, promoting the adequate construction of public policies, the promotion of best practices, and the generation of information. Regarding the emergency caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, I must highlight that the utilities throughout the country demonstrate their commitment in carrying out all the actions necessary to overcome the challenges faced during this difficult time, guaranteeing the life and health of the population. Without water or energy supply and ICT, the possibility of staying in our homes, promoting hand washing to mitigate contagion, or to work and study from home would not have been possible. Now, I would like to talk about the impacts caused by the pandemic in the provision of water and sanitation during 2020 in Colombia. Andesco gathered data from 30 water utilities, evidencing a reduction in their revenue of up to 17%, sometimes more, sometimes less. The most critical months were April and May 2020, which were the most restrictive due to the measures decreed by the government. Also, we were able to observe an exponential growth in the number of users that were not able to pay for the services, and the behavior of the overdue portfolio did not show any recovery, which was explained by the fact that users, as a result of the pandemic, accumulated unpaid bills due to the economic and social impacts of the pandemic. It's also important to mention that the pandemic has imposed new sectoral challenges. Companies have to reorganize activities and resources to continue guaranteeing the provision of water and sanitation. Also, companies had to adapt to the measures established by the government and rethink the investments planned for the mid and long terms. Companies borne the costs of recognition and reinstallation of the users, the deferral of invoices for users who did not have the ability to make payments, implemented measures to encourage payment of services by users, among other aspects. In the coming years, it's essential to establish incentives and financial schemes that strengthen investment in the sector, promoting the development of necessary infrastructure and the implementation of new technologies for the provision of these services. Efforts must be joined between the national government, local governments, and the providers to structure alternatives and the necessary tools that will allow companies to maintain and continue his improvement of the quality and coverage of services at the national and local level. Furthermore, in the case of the provision of water and sanitation, it's key to conserve the water resources, la cosecha del agua, making efforts in the preservation of river basins, promoting the adequate users of the resources by the users, and advancing in the treatment of wastewater. The public service sector has played an important role during the COVID-19 pandemic, and is a key sector for Colombia's economic reactivation. Providers are making all the efforts you can think of, implementing the necessary investment and procedures to continue providing services with quality, continuity, and efficiency, which is essential in promoting the closing of the gaps between rural and urban areas, and in achieving the national coverage and quality goals for 2030 in concordance with the SDG. Thank you.
Thank you very much, in particular for the last point, which I think is a nice transition to one of the key questions we would like to cover in the rest of the session, and how to make sure that the recovery packages actually reach out to the communities that are most affected, the most vulnerable groups. And I think your testimony resonates quite well with the results presented by Gonzalo. So there is good, they corroborate that research. That's really interesting. So thank you very much. We have a little bit of time, almost 10 to 15 minutes actually, to open the floor for questions or remarks by the participants. Kathleen, we have prepared 3 questions to frame the discussion. So maybe, Kathleen, if you could share your screen and to make sure that, just for a few minutes, just to make sure that everybody has these 3 questions in mind. The first is about the role of finances. So far, we've heard about governments and utilities, and we'd be interested to see what's the role for financiers or investors in that transition towards a greener, more resilient and inclusive recovery. So if there is a financer in the room, he or she is really very much invited to take the floor and share that perspective. The second point I just mentioned is how to make sure that recovery efforts really benefit the most vulnerable communities, and in particular contribute to a broader policy goal such as environmental justice. And the third point we already touched upon, especially in Michael's talk, on how to drive transformational action on the ground, how to make sure that recovery is not business as usual, but will lead to a transformational change. So thanks, Kathleen, for having shared that. I think we can go back to the normal view. And I really encourage our participants to share their views. You can ask for the floor or actually make a comment through the chat, which we can monitor. Before everyone, I hope that someone will actually jump in and raise his or her hand. But in the meantime, Mauricio said that utilities actually contributed to reaching out to the rural areas, people most affected and most in need of that greener, more resilient recovery. It's actually a question also for Bettina and Michael. How do you see, with your in your capacity, how do you see that recovery? These recovery packages having the ability to reach to these most in need communities, the most vulnerable groups? Do you have that capacity to target water-related investments so that they will benefit these communities? How can that be done in practice?
I'll start with a few comments. As I mentioned, most of the recovery funding efforts the U.S. has been looking at so far are funding through existing programs like the Clean Water State Revolving Fund program, working within the frameworks that certainly we encourage, because that's probably the fastest way of getting money out rather than standing up big new programs, right? But it also has the potential constraints of programs that were developed without some of those objectives in top of mind. So one thing, there's particularly for disadvantaged communities, economic distressed communities, there's more of a focus on what we call additional subsidization beyond low interest loans into grants, essentially grants for forgiveness. So one way is shifting the balance of loans towards grants, which is important to get things built, but it gets one of the things that Alonzo talked about early on was making sure that the capacity to operate there. It's not just about money and capital on the ground, but making sure that as those investments are made, that the communities can operate them, have the capacity to do so that the benefits continue to be realized. So there's that balance that we need to face there. I think a lot of it means we need to focus more on technical assistance in helping those communities rather than simply helping to build the financial, managerial, technical capacity for them to have sustainable solutions, not just the capital up front. So there's an effort to try to direct funds there as well. And then we go to rural communities, for example. It really, again, it's so state specific. You know, it's some states direct a lot of the resources towards some smaller rural communities, not so much others. So we need to work hand in hand with their partners to align those policies as much as possible.
Thank you very much, Michael. Bettina, can you be as specific and maybe illustrate how the tools you have in hands can be targeted to the ones which are most in needs?
Yes, I mean, it's a difficult question because we come, of course, from where I work, from the legislation side, and EU water legislation is for everybody and actually makes sure that everybody benefits from clean water and enough clean water. We have just revised the Drinking Water Directive, as some of you may know, which deals specifically also with this aspect of ensuring that also the vulnerable groups have access to drinking water. So I think the situation in Europe, luckily, is maybe not as dire in terms of reaching out to the communities to have this water as it may be in other parts of the world. But this being said, we are also not fully covered in terms of wastewater treatment everywhere in the EU. And this is also why for the next multi-annual financial framework, it was conceived that this money will be used also for water and sanitation. And now the recovery and resilience package, of course, comes on top of this. But I wanted to say that also this type of investment that I mentioned before, this more nature-based solutions, this concrete projects to get our rivers back to their natural states where possible, this benefits all communities, including the vulnerable ones, and it brings jobs to these communities because, of course, these concrete projects will then take place where the rivers are. So I think this is, in fact, really a new opportunity that in the past did not exist like this. I wanted to make one more point because I didn't make that before, and this is that in the EU we also don't have to take these sporadic opportunities for financing, because in the water legislation itself it is foreseen that the water system holds itself up. We have economic provisions in the Water Framework Directive, so-called cost recovery principle, that holds that there should be a price on water that allows for the water systems to be maintained. And of course, this comes alongside these possible investments under these new funding possibilities now.
Thank you, Bettina. Mauricio, you raised your hand, and then I will ask actually Gonzalo to share his views, because you have reviewed a number of packages, so you obviously will have a lot to share. But Mauricio, please go ahead.
Yes, my intervention. In Colombia, there are around, 3,700 water and sanitation utilities. 2,100 provide these services in urban areas, and 1,600 in rural areas. And although in recent years, there has been an increase in water supply coverage, action should be strengthened to achieve universal coverage and reduce the existing gaps between urban and rural areas is our principal challenge. Identify and develop measures focused in rural areas will make possible to reduce the existing gap. Most of the measures during the pandemic target utilities in urban areas, which could not be applied by rural utilities or community associations. The Ministry of Housing of Colombia has developed different programs and strategies that seek to provide drinking water and basic sanitation solutions to the population located in informal urban human settlements and also in rural areas of the country. Remember, our country has 1.1 million square kilometers. Also, there is a regulation that allows water and sanitation utilities to provide these services in urban areas with differential conditions. For these strategies to work, is fundamental to coordinate the action of the different stakeholders, national government, local government, utilities, citizens, and have a long-term commitment that strengthens and boosts the adequate development of this initiative. Other important aspect to consider, based on the experience of reporting information by the companies in the framework of the pandemic, is the opportunity to simplify and speed up data collection and analysis that allows adequate decision-making by the national government. The quality and availability of the information is relevant to address the existing issues exacerbated by the pandemic in rural and vulnerable communities. Taking this into account will facilitate the allocation of resources in the most needed areas and the process and development of public policies.
Thank you. Thank you very much also for highlighting the role of data, and seeing that the pandemic was an opportunity to strengthen data stream is I think encouraging. Gonzalo, if you have 1 minute for some takeaway messages on environmental justice, how is environmental justice reflected in some of the packages that you have reviewed?
Let me just give you a couple of examples. The first point is some of the previous problems that we faced in the water sector. So for instance, some have been mentioned so far in Colombia, Argentina, the US, France, Spain, with the fragmentation, atomization of the system in which you have a very large number of operators. This is not tackled at all by these recovery packages. So the recovery package can increase the availability of financial resources for the sector, but not necessarily addressing some of the previous concerns that we had about the sector ability to deliver a good level of service. The second point is, if you look at just two examples, because I'm mindful of time, if you look at just two examples, Vietnam and Ethiopia, countries with around 100 million people, one of them with a border to China, both of them have not been severely affected in terms of public health by the pandemic, but their water sectors are being severely affected as a result of the macroeconomic crisis and as a result of a social development crisis in those countries, which is an unintended outcome of this pandemic. So I think that it's important we don't just look at countries where we see that there's a real problem in terms of public health. We also look at how public health can be a driver of additional problems to the sector.
Good point. Thanks very much. Helen, you have the daunting task of trying to share with us some of your takeaway messages. So I'm afraid the conversation with the group of participants was not so lively, but still, from what you've heard from the panelists and the speakers, what are your 2 or 3 main takeaway messages?
Yeah, thank you, Xavier, and thank you to all of the speakers who shared their insights on the recovery measures and the impacts of COVID on the different regions in the world. And when I look back, what I'm taking away is that actually water was really featured in the recovery packages and in the actions against the COVID crisis across the globe. For example, in Europe, water was monitored to track the virus. Also, water plays a central role in the UN Green Deal. That's what we heard. We heard that water plays a central role in the US Rescue Pact and in the infrastructure plans in the US. And the central issue seems to be the implementation of these legislations and the implementations of the projects on the ground. And the crucial point is what was also highlighted several times is to do it in an innovative way, not using conventional old or approaches that we already know, but rather look for transformational approaches, shovel-worthy that rather than shovel-ready. Colombia, we heard, wants to use technology, new digital tools to achieve water coverage both in rural and urban areas. And I would also like to highlight one aspect, and again, the importance of this discussion and the role of water for the recovery and to build resilience, maybe also to look from a younger generation point of view, that it is essential that the recovery and the recovery funds are used to build resilience for the future shocks and crises, which also includes the current climate crisis. And water there will play a central role to build the resilience for people and communities and systems. And I would like to invite you also to continue this discussion with us. And here I want to highlight our next roundtable meeting on financing water with a focus on climate action, which will take place on the 23rd and 24th of September. And I invite you to register to the meeting, so you will automatically be informed for all the information. Thank you,
Helen. You may wish to share the link to the roundtable meeting into the chat for participants.
Yeah, I'll do that on the Pathable platform.
Yeah, so that it can stay there. Thanks very much. The final remarks will be given by Aileen Burke. It's my pleasure to invite you to take the floor, Aileen. Aileen is the global lead for water resources management at the World Bank, the water global practice. Aileen, you've been listening. Not sure what's going on. I have a sound issue, but we'll manage. Aileen, you've been very patiently listening to the discussion. I wonder what your takeaway messages are and whether some of the things you've heard can inform the work of the World Bank and the global water practice more specifically.
Thanks, Xavier. And on behalf of all the organizers, OECD, World Bank, and the United States, we'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. I think we started with a rather sobering message. Gonzalo painted for us that we had a water sector already under pressure, and that there was tremendous pressure to improve performance and financial and long-term sustainability of the sector before COVID even hit. But at the same time, and that COVID just increased these pressures and further magnified equity issues as well as liquidity issues in the sector. But at the same time, there's a flip side. There's a tremendous opportunity to use green recovery efforts to really get the sector to where we need it to be. So hang on just a moment, sorry. One of the COVID pressures I think we're all facing is kids at home with all of this. So we've got a little background noise here. I apologize for that. Just highlighting some of the pressure we have. Just a moment.
We sympathize with this situation, Aileen. No worries.
So I think what we heard though is that also that this is a balancing act. We need to balance between shovel-ready versus shovel-worthy projects. We need to balance between the pressure to deliver infrastructure with the pressure to deliver long-term sustainability. And many of the countries gave us examples of incentive structures that they're putting in place to do that, whether it's moving from loans to grants, whether it's earmarking the green infrastructure and giving space for nature-based solutions to emerge, and allowing more time to put these solutions in place. We also heard from the EU a great number of examples that they had in place already as part of their Green Deal before the COVID crisis hit that I think we can learn from. And we heard from Colombia the tremendous pressure that they're under to really put incentives into place to use this crisis to, rather than further the inequalities between formal and informal settlements, urban and rural, ways in which we can use this as a way to close that gap for greater long-term development. I just wanted to highlight that if you're looking for the quantification of some of these challenges, Gonzalo's paper, the OECD World Bank paper, will be coming out in the coming months. We also have from the World Bank paper on green, resilient, inclusive development that was released in April, and that really pulls together some of the efforts across our member countries globally to look at how to use COVID to fuel this green, resilient, inclusive development in the water sector and beyond, as well as World Bank climate strategy that was released in July that looks at using the response to COVID as a way of advancing our climate goals, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation. So with that, I'd like to say a huge thanks to everyone for your participation today and listening to us. It's a big road we have ahead, but it's great to hear that we're all coming together and starting this discussion. And we look forward to working with all of you to continue this work. So thanks again, everybody.
Thank you, Eileen. I think with this, we can conclude. Indeed, big thanks to the speakers, to Gonzalo for the research. Great collaboration with the World Bank. We're very happy to explore further opportunities on this topic, and indeed to be continued when the report will be launched. So thank you very much, and we wish you a lovely rest of your day and a World Water Week.